Hello boys and girls, we're going to continue reading Oliver and the Seawigs and we're on to chapter 6. As the furlstone vanished, all Cliff's newfound hopefulness drained away. The fight went out of him. Iris and Oliver felt him slump. They couldn't blame him, poor old giant. So much of his golden sand and drifts of flotsam had been washed away when he scooped to fetch the water mole. Now it was gone. His stony head was even more bare than before. You can see it from that picture. "What shall we do?" asked Iris. "Go after that furlstone, of course," shouted Oliver. "Quick, Cliff, follow him." Cliff lifted his cave mouth out of the wave to say, "What's the point? He's beaten me." Then he subsided again. "You can't just let him win," said Oliver. "Is he the island who deserves to win the Night of the Seawigs? And as if that Stacey de Lacy. Go after them and get the water mole back." "How?" rumbled Cliff. "They have an army of monkeys." "He's got a point," said Iris. "Then go to the hallowed shallows," insisted Oliver. "Tell everyone what Stacey and his furlstone did." "They won't listen to me," said Cliff wearily. "They'll be too busy admiring the furlstone's marvellous seawig and laughing at me." "So what are we going to do?" Iris asked. Cliff sighed. "I'm going to settle," he decided. "No!" yelled Oliver. "I should have done it years ago," Cliff went on. "What's the point of it all, this trampling around, collecting stuff? I'm going to stand here and grow roots and forget I ever was a rambler. I'll become just an island. That's all I'm good for. I'm useless, finished, washed up." He sank back slowly into the sea. "No!" shouted Oliver again. He did a dance of frustration, shin deep in the wavelets which washed Cliff's shores. But no amount of stamping or shouting would make Cliff come up again. Oliver remembered the sad, lifeless, settled islands which Iris had shown him on the way to the sarcastic sea. He imagined the sand and silt slowly piling up around Cliff's feet. "Oh dear," said Iris, with salt tears dripping off her chin. "I think he means it." "Now look what you've done," sniffed Mr. Culpepper, fussingly rearranging his nest, which had been terribly knocked about by those swarming sea monkeys. "If you hadn't dragged us here in this search of this stupid wreck, this would never have happened. It's all your fault." "Well, I'm not going to let Stacey de Lacy win," said Oliver. "Years of exploring has taught me that you don't solve problems by sitting around and complaining about them. You have to do something. That's how his mum and dad had saved him from the Commando dragon. That's how they'd escaped from the dungeons of Mooby Mooby." He struck an explorish pose on the shore and said, "I'm going to go after that furlstone and show it that it can't just go around snitching other people's shipwrecks and kidnapping mums and dads." "That's all very well and good," said Iris. "But army of monkeys, remember? Oh, and your boat's gone, all flop." Oliver ignored the reminder about the monkeys. He hadn't yet thought of any way that he could deal with them. He had an answer to the part about the boat, though. He opened his explorer's pack and triumphantly pulled out a foot pump and a punctured dinghy repair kit. 1 hour of patching and pumping later, he was ready. He shoved the dinghy into the waves and hoisted himself aboard. He tugged the motor starter cord. It didn't work. It never did. You needed big muscly arms like Dad's to make it start. Iris looked on doubtfully. "I suppose I could help," she said. "Oh yes, you're a lot of use," snapped Oliver, so sarcastically that even the seaweed was shocked. "Your arms are even feebler than mine." "Oh, I don't mean like that. Don't be mean like that," sniffed the mermaid. She unhooked the motor from the stern of the dinghy and dropped it on the shore. Then, before Oliver could ask how she was supposed to help, she scrambled half aboard the dinghy with her tail hanging off behind. "Shove off," she said. "Oh, isn't that rude?" whispered the wind admiringly. "I mean shove the dinghy off." Oliver shoved. As the dinghy drifted into the deeper water, Iris started to flap her tail up and down, driving them away from the shore. It was difficult to steer at first, but they soon worked at it. Iris took the dinghy on to a farewell circuit of this island. Oliver looked over the side, down through the waves at the great dim Cliff's face looming there. He couldn't see if Cliff's eyes were open or closed. He couldn't tell if the rambling island was watching his friends leave, or just too sad to care. He waved anyway. Mr. Culpepper flapped over to perch on the dinghy's brow. "I might as well come with you," he said. "After all, you'll need help finding that thieving island, I suppose." So the albatross took off again, soaring towards the horizon, and the mermaid-powered dinghy followed him, splashing along the lane of open water which the Furlstone had left through the sarcastic weed. There you can see her using a tail. It was tiring work for poor Iris. Every few minutes she had to stop and rest while Oliver refuelled her by feeding her caramel bars from his lunchbox. But at last the sarcastic sea was left behind. "I wonder why Stacey de Lacy is so keen to help the Furlstone win the contest anyway," wondered Oliver. But Iris was too busy being in an outboard motor to reply. Mr. Culpepper flew above, calling down directions. At first there was no need for Oliver, and Iris could see the Furlstone far ahead. But as the day wore on, the thieving island drew away from them, and a strange haze arose. Soon it was hard for even the sharp-eyed albatross to see very far. "We are coming near to the hallowed shallows," said Iris. They began to pass other rambling islands. At first they looked like normal islands, but they were all moving in the same direction, with white wakes of foam stretching behind them. Some of them were small and tatty as Cliff. Some were magnificent. There was one that had sculpted a sort of volcano on his upper parts and lit a fire in it so trails of smoke rings mingled with the haze. There was one had drizzled wet sand around his head to build up teetering spirals, and another that had arranged miles and miles of weed into a massive beehive with a small ship stuck in the middle of it. None of them paid the slightest attention to the dinghy. "If only Cliff was here," said Oliver, feeling sad that he'd left their own rambling island behind. "The rest would only laugh at him," said Iris. "Some of those Seawigs are to die for." And there you can see the one with a beehive and the weeds, one with a volcano. And there they are, look, in the dinghy going along. Meanwhile, back in the sarcastic sea, Cliff was thinking sadly of his friends. He had never had actual people living on him before, and he missed them now that they were gone. Not only that, the seaweed had drifted close now that he was not moving, and it kept jeering and sniggering at him and saying how brave it thought he was. No, he told itself, it's no use worrying. He'd had enough all these years wandering and gathering things just so some other island can pinch them. That's it, I'm settling here. Maybe one day someone will put another danger submerged rock sign on me. And he shut his eyes and sank his toes down deep into the sea floor and tried to stand as still and lifeless as the other rock of the ocean. But he could not stop his mind from working. He could not stop himself thinking. He thought how wrong it was that the Furlstone was allowed to roam around wrecking other people's wigs. Then he thought sadly that the water mole was the best thing he'd ever found. And then he thought that actually Oliver and Iris were the best things he'd found. He began to worry again. He began to think about that. Maybe the jeering weed was right to hint that he'd been cowardly. Maybe Oliver had been right. Maybe he should go to the hallowed shallows and tell the other islands what a rotten-hearted Furlstone was up to. "Somebody's got to do something," he said aloud, "and Oliver and Iris are too small. Mr. Culpepper is just an albatross. So that somebody must be, me." "Ooh," said all the seaweed, tittering in that annoying way it had. But it soon stopped, for Cliff was on the move again, striding and swimming as quickly as he could towards the same horizon that Oliver's dinghy had vanished over. We are on to chapter 7. I'm going to leave it there and I will carry on in a minute.